Hello world and welcome to FireTech Connect. My guest today is the Research Director for Cyber Physical Systems at CSIRO's Data61. She's an experienced R&D leader and holds a PhD in Earth Science from the Australian National University and an MBA with the University of Queensland Business School. With a focus on disruptive technologies, she set up the world's first robotic vision research centre and led the development of Australia's first Robotics Roadmap, outlining how robotics and automation will impact on every sector of the Australian economy. She is a fellow graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and serves on the board of the CRC for optimising resource extraction, Queensland AI Hub, which we will have a conversation about, and Women in Robotics International, and is responsible for bringing the Grace Hopper celebration to Australia. Welcome, Dr Sue Keay. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Lee.
So we were talking just offline about robotics, and I think if there's, I don't think there's a better person to have that discussion with than yourself. Just kick off with a conversation I had with someone the other day about robots and this sort of debate that seems to be going around robots taking our jobs.
Yeah.
Are robots going to take our jobs?
Yes, it's a very common question, and I think that fear of robots is simply fear of the unknown, and people worry about robots taking jobs without probably ever really having seen a robot or seen a robot in a workplace. And I think once robots become more common, it'll become apparent to everybody not only what their capabilities are, but most importantly what their limitations are, because robots are in no way humans. Robots tend to be very good at tasks, and most jobs are combined of a number of different tasks. So a lot of the economic evidence that I've seen is actually that robots actually increase the number of jobs available. I think the distinction that people maybe get confused with is that in creating jobs, they will be different jobs to the jobs that we've seen in the past. And so I think that, and it's not just robots, as we have to adapt to, the increasing pace of technological disruption, people will have to, get used to a new normal where we have to train for different jobs continuously through our lives. And it's how we support people on that journey to learn new skills that is really important, and hopefully break down this barrier that people seem to have that robots, lead to immediate job reduction, because so far that doesn't seem to hold true. And in areas where we've seen robots actually go into the workplace, we saw this example in a local hospital. Very soon people realized that the robots actually have very limited capabilities, and so that their jobs weren't under any threat anytime soon. But interestingly, once the robots have been there for a while, people start to see what they can do with them. And often it's the people who are in those environments who are best suited to find opportunities for robots that can actually help them do their jobs. So the key with developing robots for most researchers, it's about taking people out of dangerous, unsafe conditions, but most importantly, it's about augmenting human potential. So it's not about removing humans from all processes. It's about actually making ways that we can get humans to be even better at the jobs that they do.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion. I note that I think in the 2016 election, Donald Trump famously said that he wanted to bring back Middle America, and he was going to bring back manufacturing and bring back the manufacturing jobs. And one of the news commentators pointed out to him that in actual fact, yes, manufacturing would be great to bring back, but it's not necessarily going to bring back the jobs that were once in manufacturing, because a lot of it was going to be automated and robotic, right?
Yes. So I think it certainly changes the types of jobs that exist in different sectors. But if you have a look at some local examples, and there's a really good one here in Brisbane. So there's a local company called UAP, which was very strongly involved in the development of the Advanced Robotics Manufacturing Hub. That is a national organisation, but was sort of started here in Brisbane and supported by the Queensland government. They actually have some evidence that bringing robotics into their processes has actually led to them creating jobs because it's made their whole business more productive. And if you can be more efficient and then be producing new things, then you need to bring in new people. And
Right.
so I think that it will probably take us a while to get enough case studies to probably convince people. But I think there's actually a lot of opportunities for job creation by making, I mean, really, that is one of the core purposes of robotics, is to actually get away from a lot of the dull and repetitive work that humans aren't actually very good at, and have humans doing higher value and arguably more interesting and creative work.
I saw a hotel in Japan, you know, through the COVID crisis, using robots as concierge and using robots as you know, guest services people, which was really quite amazing to see that.
Yes.
Like robots don't get COVID-19.
Well, there's that, but also there's the whole aspect of, you know, what jobs do we want to keep? You can imagine that as a concierge, often you might get asked the same question 50 times a day. And after a while, that might become quite tiring. I think it's also a bit of a health risk for many people working in hotels, the number of people that actually open their hotel doors with no clothes on, apparently. So in that situation, I'd probably prefer to be able to send, you know, the concierge robot up to see what that particular room wanted. But I guess another thing that people maybe don't think of is that we can program these robots to understand as many different languages as possible. So rather than, you know, maybe only being able to understand some languages, if you're in a foreign country and you go to a hotel that has one of these concierge robots, you can actually hope that it will be able to speak to you in your native language, which can actually be quite a good selling point. Because it's always very uncomfortable if you're traveling somewhere and you find that you know, you don't speak the local language, and this takes that barrier away.
Yeah. So let's talk about cyber physical systems. For those that don't understand, what are cyber physical systems and what does it encompass in terms of the technology?
Yeah, okay, so cyber physical systems, I like to say, is just a flash way of talking about how we combine the digital with the physical. So it's about how we connect physical devices and the data that they are generating, and make sense of them, and have those devices communicating with one another. And, you know, in many cases, in the case of robots, actually making decisions and taking action in the real world. So if you think of cyber physical systems as like your laptop on legs. They can move around in the physical environment and interact with it, so that they're not just part of the digital world, they're also part of the physical world. So that's where the cyber and physical come in. And the sort of things that you would think of when you think of cyber physical systems are not just robots, but it's about the sensors that either robots carry or that we have out in the environment. Simple things like cameras that communicate online, cyber physical system. And, you know, then we can get quite complex cyber physical systems, such as ones that we might develop for cybernetics. So you're combining the physical, digital, and the biological. So actually creating devices that are monitoring processes in your body and taking action. So you can think of a pacemaker as a cyber physical system.
Right. Okay. And some of the cool stuff that I've seen around robotics comes out of Boston Dynamics. Some of the videos and demos they do, mind blowing what they can get, the agility they can build into these robots, and the sort of the sturdiness. I saw one where they were pushing the robot and it was pushing back, and it was very, very difficult to actually push it over. What are the systems that go into that type of robotics?
Well, it's interesting. We used to take a lot of, I guess, inspiration from the animal world. And so you might notice many of Boston Dynamics robots actually are named after animals like cheetah, because it goes fast. And often the way that those are designed are by looking at the, you know, biomechanics of an animal and figuring out what it is that makes them fast, and then translating that into a mechanical object. However, increasingly what we're doing is applying machine learning to do that same thing, so that we can develop mechanical systems that perhaps we might never have even imagined in the past. And so I guess increasingly a lot of the work that we're doing is all based on how we can apply machine learning to develop systems and also to test those systems out to see how we can break them quickly and usually break them in the digital world. So before we even build them, be testing them out in simulations, seeing how they work, and then when we're sure that we've got them very robust, then actually making that into a mechanical system and trying it out in the real world.
Right. And so, you talk about the machine learning component, and I have this conversation with people regularly, and the whole idea of AI. I've been around tech for a long time. I went, through periods where if you stuck .com in front of something, it quadrupled its value. If you put cloud in front of something, then all of a sudden it was the currency of the time. And it seems, more recently it's been AI. Every startup throws AI into their pitch deck. And investors naively go, oh, it's got AI, oh, it's machine learning. And you're and my associate and friend Chris Bowden and I have this conversation all the time, that it's actually about machine learning, not necessarily about the artificial intelligence and such. Can you help sort of demystify the AI and machine learning and what it all means?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't actually have a degree in computer science, so that's a pretty tall order.
But from your perspective, in terms of the work that you do.
Yeah, so I guess robotics intersects with artificial intelligence. You can have robots that do not apply artificial intelligence, but I guess the result of that is that they're not very smart. So in my mind, it's really about how you make smart machines. So these are ones that are able to actually not only be out in the environment collecting data, but are given the tools that are required to interpret that data and then control the actions that they are going to take next. And I guess the advantage of artificial intelligence and machine learning is that it cuts down the learning process for the robot or cyber physical system, because in the past you would have had to have coded a whole range of different possibilities into that system to be able to get it to respond in ways that a person would understand as being reasonable or practical. Whereas with machine learning, we can actually just now train those systems up to do the sort of things that we would expect of them, and hopefully minimize the number of unexpected things that the system might do. And artificial intelligence is completely critical to that. And otherwise we would have very dumb systems that, I guess, like traffic lights, they can sense when a vehicle is approaching and they can, potentially change, but they're not smart enough to actually see that actually there's a cyclist that has gone through a red light, and maybe it would make sense for the lights to change at the intersection to protect that. We're not at that level of understanding, and that's really where artificial intelligence makes a difference.
So in terms of robotics, there's a couple of really interesting robotic companies I've been talking to with regard to the FireTech Connect program. But it seems to me there's a lot of really promising technologies sort of still in R&D in universities and those types of institutions. How do we get better at commercializing that and getting it out into the marketplace?
Well, that's the $64 million question, really, isn't it, Lee? And, I think that unfortunately, what you've identified is that there are real structural barriers in how the research that is done at universities and research organisations, and then where the research needs to be for it to be taken up by industry. And the way that we fund research tends to mean that it's actually quite fortuitous if we ever get to the point that we can build a prototype of something. So you can imagine from the point of view of a business, if you can't even show someone a prototype, if you're really just explaining an idea, then it's pretty hard to really put your faith in something like that. And in many things, people aren't early adopters anyway. They prefer to see that it's been in use by other people before they even give it a go. And that's really where the gap is. So finding ways that we can take things from prototype through to a more robust product that people can try is really important. One thing we've been experimenting with is something we call an early adopter program, where we, I guess, reduce the price for people to try some of the technologies that we're developing, and also try and build up better networks of connections with SMEs who are in our space, and actually try and get the technology out into their hands as quickly as possible so that they can give us an indication of, you know, how it works, whether it's adding value, you know, whether there are any key points that need to be changed. But there's a limit to how much we can do that, because it takes us away from our core research. And frankly, there's just not the funding to bridge that gap. And until we can find ways to fund the bridging of that gap, it's very difficult. And I think the only thing that we can hope is that if we can start building better connections, particularly between our SMEs, because small to medium-sized enterprises are really, you know, the key drivers of Australia. We're a nation of SMEs. And trying to get them more involved in the research process is important. But as you're probably aware, you know, I guess, again, traditionally our research organisations have been set up to, you know, mainly deal with other large organisations, not with small, nimble companies. And that needs to change too.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Lani Rafidi, who's the head of cybersecurity for Deloitte. I don't know whether you know Lani, but really interesting guy. And he made the comment that, you know, we were talking about the barriers to, you know, procurement from an early stage company technology perspective, and the risk that corporates and governments have around that, and how do we mitigate that. And he made the comment, which is a well-worn mantra, is that nobody in an organization ever got fired for buying IBM. Yeah. It sort of goes to that risk, doesn't it? It's like, if I buy IBM, I know it's safe, it's trusted, and, you know, but if I try this out, I know from my own experience, it's been, you know, very challenging to get new ideas and new technology to break down those barriers. But let's talk about Australian cyber physical systems technology, and where do you see it at the moment?
Yeah, Australia's got quite a good reputation in the world for developing cyber physical systems. And the reason for that is that, you know, Australia, just by nature of our circumstance, being a very large continent with a small population, we've had to develop systems that are robust, that can operate without much human interaction, because we have to. Because, you know, if you think of it, we have thousands of kilometres of infrastructure, roads, rail lines, pipelines, power lines, that all need to be inspected and made safe. And it's actually, we don't actually have enough people to be able to do those tasks. So this is where cyber physical systems can really play a very important role. And, you know, Australia has gotten very good at developing systems that can operate out in the sort of extreme, harsh environmental conditions that we have. So they have to be robust to operate in either very hot or cold climates. They have to be able to operate over long distances. They have to be able to operate in areas where they might be denied communications, particularly underwater or underground. And they have to be able to operate with pretty much low or no power requirements, because, you know, you can't just have someone going out and changing the batteries every 5 seconds. And additionally, you need to have them so that they use very low computer processing power as well. All of those factors combined have meant that we've had to develop really resilient systems, and in many cases, to apply to our unique environment, we've had to develop them at a continental scale. So that really sets us in a good position to be able to, I guess, you know, take some of that technology to the rest of the world. But in particular, now we have an Australian Space Agency. It's a great opportunity for us to experiment with how those can be used in space, because those are exactly the sort of characteristics that you would look for in a cyber physical system that has to go somewhere before humans perhaps ever get there.
So, I mean, it's interesting you talk about the space program, And I found that, there's two schools of thought with that. And it's interesting that there seems to be a debate around the value of space programs and the fact that we pour billions of dollars into these programs. And, it's well documented that some of the technologies that came out of the early space races in the 60s are things that we still use today. But there is also the argument that, there's probably higher priorities where we could be allocating financial resources. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that you're always going to have that debate because there are always immediate priorities that you might on the surface seem that they are more deserving of funding. But I think the true value of investing in space research and space exploration is just because I think it's powerfully transformative. And it really expands our imagination. And I think this is where artificial intelligence is key for humans as well. Because when we explore space, we're exploring an area that is, had previously been unknowable to us. And I think that just leads to a whole chain of thinking of new ways of doing things that if we only looked at how we need to survive on Earth, we would never even consider. So by focusing on space, it actually pushes the boundaries of what we think and know we can do. And I think that's really important. And we won't come up with a lot of inventive material unless we aspire to some of these grand visions of what the future might look like, and a future that includes being places other than Earth.
It seems amazing to me that we are a very inventive nation. We're a very resilient nation. But over the last 4 or 5 years, I've noted that the World Economic Forum and the World Innovation Index, we keep slipping down the bottom of that. In one, I think we were just ahead of Malta and just behind Austria at 73 on the scale, and it bewilders me why that is, because we do seem to have amazing minds, amazing inventors. What is it about our lack of ability in that innovation space? Why are we 73rd ranked in the world?
Because there's a lot of amazing Australian innovators in Silicon Valley and in Europe and in other countries where, it has been more attractive to be based. Now, it's interesting in the current circumstances whether we might see a shift in that, because we might actually be able to retain some or even attract back some of the talent that we've lost through the years. But I think we have endured years and years of brain drain, because I think it's no secret to the rest of the world that, Australia is actually a good source of talent. And some of the big tech giants make no secret of the fact that they come out here to, soak up our talent, and they don't soak it up and do their research here. They soak it up and they take it back to wherever they're based. And, I actually think that that's very short-sighted of many of these tech companies, because at the end of the day, they are wanting to have their technology implemented all over the world. They want it to be global. And yet if they continue to suck dry all of the talent of many of the countries that are their customers, well, eventually there'll be a reckoning, and those countries will not be able to sustain that level of investment in technology. And that's my fear for Australia. I think that, yes, we have all of these natural advantages, people who are talented, think outside the box, and yet, I think we're really at a bit of a knife edge as to whether we can keep up with all of the technological changes that are happening in the world and make sure that our population has the opportunity to be educated about all of those changes and participate in them and hopefully drive a lot of those changes.
So I think it applies, I take your point on the brain drain. I mean, we've heard a lot and I've read a lot about the brain drain, and look, I spent half of my life living in America and Europe. So, partly because, the technology that I've worked with around web technologies is all about scale, and 20 million people is not a big enough market to scale in. If you're going to scale, you need to be in Europe, you need to be in North America. And particularly if you're attracting in big investment, the capital markets here haven't really been geared towards technology. It's been very focused around mining. And so if you bring in the European or US investors, they want scale and they want you to be in the US. So it's a similar thing that you're talking about from a corporate brain drain and, you know, that talent, as much as it is the early stage company. Now, I've found it's a great place to test, to validate, and to iterate. But when it comes to actually putting the foot on the gas and growing, you can't do it here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that your point's completely valid. I just wish that there were some ways we could be more creative in trying to solve that. You know, potentially having Australian companies that have a US arm that does that side of the business for them. But I'm not sure whether you know, but my sister, Dr Keay, is the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics. And so she sees it from the US side. She sees a lot of Australian startup robotics companies who don't even bother looking for capital investment in Australia. They just go straight to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And who can blame them? I mean, we have, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's less than 1/100th of the venture capital available here as they do in the US. And, you know, my sister has often wondered, you know, once companies make that decision, then it's like, you know, the Australian government locks them out forever because they're no longer Australian. So even those companies might be founded by Australians, might actually have, you know, a really, you know, a positive attitude towards trying to, you know, lift Australia up. There are no way back. There's no way back in.
Yeah.
So they are, from that point onward, treated like a foreign company. And I think somehow we have to break that down, because otherwise, yes, we're going to continue to suffer that brain drain, because people will need to move overseas to capture investment and also to be able to scale. We really need to find a model where that you can either help bring those companies back so that they have headquarters here in Australia, or that they can be based here but still access those capital markets. And I think that, you know, I'm not a policy specialist, but I would be optimistic enough to think that there must be ways that we can do that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. There's got to be more creative ways to sort of, you know, stop the brain drain. And, you know, it's understandable that companies have got to go into bigger markets to scale. But as you say, how do you still, you know, rather than just sort of cut the tie and say, well, there you go, you're US now. How do we keep them? But I can't let you go past the comment about your sister being there. What were your parents feeding you that you both ended up in robotics?
Oh, well, you know, my mum actually taught herself how to code in COBOL, which was the language Grace Hopper developed.
Yes, I know COBOL.
Yep. So she was a librarian, but she was, you know, interested in how they could automate some of those, you know, the processes that occur in libraries at the time. So I guess she was a bit ahead of her time in that respect. And my dad was a physics professor, so I guess we had a bit of exposure. We were a family of early adopters. And yeah, no, my sister led the way into robotics, and she told me I really should get on board. I didn't listen to her advice for quite a long time, but, you know, I guess eventually I followed her into it.
You eventually came around to saw the light.
That's right.
But you know, interesting that your sister is in Silicon Valley, because, you know, I've spent time living in Silicon Valley as well, and, you know, you have that perspective from there. And I've also spent time raising capital in this market in Australia. And one of the interesting things is that the market sort of tries to convince you that it gets it. You know, we get it. And, you know, certainly it's changed over the last 5 years, particularly. And there has been more of an appetite, and there's more, you know, what I'd say sophisticated technology investors. But, you know, back in the day, you know, it was all geared around mining. It wasn't huge amounts of money, and, you know, they didn't understand technology scaling and the burn rates that are required to get to that scale.
Yep.
And I used to have a bit of a joke with the Australian market where, you know, they'd say, yeah, we love the tech. Now, when do we start digging? You know, when do we start drilling holes? It's like, you know, it was all about, yes, we get it, but actually it's really a mining paradigm that we're existing in. So part of that is that, as you said before, the funding and the capital. How do we redirect some of that capital and redirect some of that funding so that we can enable both investment and also the retention of some of these companies and potentially the brain drain as well?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I think, you know, some of the, I might not have mentioned, but, you know, I chair a new company called the Robotics Australia Group, which is, you know, looking to be the voice of robotics in Australia. And, you know, one of the ideas that we're exploring is some sort of future fund that would be specific for hardware development, because, you know, as you'd be aware, it's hard enough to raise capital for investment in software, but, you know, add hardware into the equation, and
Yeah.
you know, I guess unless, as you say, it's dumb hardware like drilling, it's really hard to get investment.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know that we've got an answer to that, except I do believe that if we were, I do believe in clusters. And so we've fortunately recently developed a Queensland robotics cluster. It's just getting off the ground. But I think that if you have a look at other parts of the world where they've been successful in developing technology clusters, it can act as its own ecosystem that generates investment, because you have conditions where you have talent and technologies and an attractive environment for them to exist, and the investment follows. It's hard to know whether it's, you know, chicken or egg. But I think once you get that ecosystem going, then, you know, it should be self-perpetuating. But we're not there yet. But that's, I guess, what you know, that would be my vision for the future, that we're actually able to develop some clusters across different parts of Australia. And frankly, Australia does a terrible job admitting that it has a technology industry. You know, and I think it's true that a lot of our technology is actually done in what people consider the more traditional industries, like mining and like manufacturing. But that doesn't make it any less technology. And yet we never own it. We never say, actually, we're really good at technology. In fact, probably if you were to ask most Australians on the street to name an Australian technology company, they would probably struggle.
Well, you know, it's interesting because one of my companies was a mining automation software platform, right? That's what we did. We automated the process of mobilizing large scale workforce into remote major oil and gas projects.
Yeah.
And through that involvement, I got to see, you know, what some of the stuff that Rio Tinto were doing, some of the stuff that Chevron were doing around robotics in the mining industry.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm no robotics expert, but I looked at that and thought, wow, that's got to be leading edge. That's got to be, you know, really sort of cutting edge technology that we're doing in robotics. But because it's mining, as you say, it's almost like, oh, well, we sort of dumb it down, but it's advanced robotics.
Well, yes, and unfortunately, while some of those technologies were originally developed in Australia, you know, we don't have many native, or in fact, we don't have any native OEMs, right? So it then gets taken overseas, and, you know, most of the benefits of those creations actually accrue to different countries where they have the OEMs, where they test a lot of those autonomous load haulage vehicles and other, you know, autonomous creations, and we don't see the benefit. Then they sell them back to us.
Yeah, well, we moved to Texas. So let's talk about the Robotics Roadmap for Australia. What does it look like? What is it, and what does it look like?
Yeah, so we released the first version of the Robotics Roadmap in mid-2018, and it was really just a first attempt to try and define what robotics in Australia looked like, what was our capability, like what was the size even. Because at the time I was working with the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision, and we had some good connections with a couple of robotics companies, but, you know, by no means did we think we knew everyone in the ecosystem. And, you know, I looked around and I noticed that in other parts of the world, they'd gone through a process developing robotics roadmaps. In the US, they've had 3 different versions. In many cases, these have led to quite an increase in investment in the field once the roadmap kind of has pointed out what the opportunities are. And in some countries like China, they have very well articulated strategies around both robotics and artificial intelligence, which they are seriously implementing. So I thought, well, this will be a good first step. And then hopefully Australia will get to the point where we have our own strategy around where we want to be in robotics and artificial intelligence. And so, we started off having sort of workshops across the country. I tried to map out what our capability was using a range of different metrics. And, we discovered that, and I think this is quite conservative, that there are more than 1,000 companies in Australia that have that capability, that they employ more than 50,000 people, and
Wow.
that they're worth, I think, in excess of $12 billion to the Australian economy.
Wow.
But, until you can articulate the benefit of a particular sector of the economy, you're really talking about nothing, because people aren't interested unless you can actually say, well, this is how many companies actually exist, and this is the actual benefit to Australia. Why would anyone pay any attention? And one of the challenges, and this is a challenge for many areas, not just robotics, is that, we divide things up into these different sectors. And, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has everything divided up into these different sectors, and it makes sense for them to not change those definitions because they're trying to compile information over time. But then when you have a new industry crop up, then the information is lost, because the example you just gave, you can have robotics companies that service the mining industry, you can have ones that service agriculture, you can have ones that you apply in healthcare. Where do they fit? Are they service companies? Are they manufacturers? They could be a combination of all of these things.
Right.
And so it really was just a first attempt to try and get a handle on what the industry looked like. And one of the most rewarding things about doing the roadmap was the number of case studies that that emerged in the process of, people doing quite exceptional things here in Australia, but that sadly are completely invisible. No one actually knows that they're occurring. I've even had visitors from overseas who ask me why Australia bothers doing anything in robotics, because, can't we just buy that tech from other countries? And, I suppose there's a point to that, but I think Australia does have some unique circumstances that mean that there are reasons that, and I think we can be quite proud of how well we have, we've led the world in developing certain things like mining automation, but also applications to the environment and protecting the environment. But yeah, all of that was just a blank canvas before we did the first roadmap. And now we're looking at doing a second version of the roadmap. And, my hope is that we will be able to unearth even more examples of this capability and get a better sense of its value, so that hopefully we will be able to attract investment, encourage the government to have a look at policies that will help us to actually have robotics companies, native robotics companies, develop here in Australia, and how we can best support those. Because I think there's also a bit of confusion too between consumption and creation. So on the one hand, when people hear Industry 4.0, it's about, how companies can digitally transform and potentially take on technologies like robotics. But I think we should be aspiring to be also creating those robots, rather than just buying them from somewhere and implementing them. Why are we not also creating them? And if you have a look at a country like China, that they have very well articulated that strategy. So they know that their manufacturing sector cannot remain competitive without introducing robots. So they've taken the precaution of investing a lot of money to make sure that their domestic robotic supply is met by domestic robotic manufacturers. So they invested a lot of money to purchase KUKA Robotics, a European robotic firm, so that they can be 100% self-sufficient in the production of their robots. And if COVID-19 has demonstrated anything to people, it is that you have to be pretty careful to be protective of your sovereign supply chain capabilities.
Absolutely.
And I think robotics is an important part of that conversation. If we really want to be serious about protecting many of our supply chains, then robotics is a solution. And one reason that it's also important to consider is that for us to be able to preserve some of our supply chains, in some instances, we may not actually have the number of people necessary to, create a capability in an area. And that's where application of robotic technologies might come in really handy.
I think that's really important point about the supply chain, and I think that it has given the world a bit of a wake up on this globalization and centralized manufacturing out of China. We've seen it in the US with their their PPE supplies, and we've seen that disruption in that supply chain. So I think that to that point, how do we now take this opportunity in Australia to bring back our advanced manufacturing? And that, what a great place to start with advanced manufacturing in the robotics sector.
Yes.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about the AI hub in Brisbane.
Yep.
I think you've been appointed on the board of that, and there's been some money invested by the Queensland government through the Advanced Queensland Initiative. Is that correct?
That's correct. So over 4 years, to build up
Right.
the hub. And it's really about actually highlighting that Queensland, is almost a destination for artificial intelligence. We know that there is such a demand for artificial intelligence talent in Queensland that I think there are, 8 opportunities for, every one, qualified
Right.
specialist. And so we need to find ways that we can feed that supply. So I guess a couple of things. It's about helping companies to adapt to, digital transformation and how they can apply artificial intelligence in their business and recognize, what is AI versus what's not AI. But it's also about...
It's all AI now, isn't it? Isn't everything AI?
Well, I think it's very confusing for people. It's true. But also it's about giving people the opportunities to learn artificial intelligence themselves, because the Queensland AI Hub came about, I don't know whether you were involved at all, but Natalie Wren's created a meetup group in Brisbane called Brisbane AI. And, it wasn't overnight, but, it attracted I think it's got more than 3,000 members. And so it really highlighted that there was a lot of community interest in artificial intelligence, but that people were struggling to find ways that they could learn more and educate themselves. And so the meetup group has formed still very strong. And Natalie developed a couple of training programs so that rather than have to go back and do a computer science degree, people had the opportunity to learn the bits of artificial intelligence that they were interested in a shorter 6 to 12 week format. So I think Queensland AI Hub is really taking all of that forward. So looking at ways that we can help train people up in artificial intelligence, or at least connect them in with the right training providers so that they can get that, with helping companies to adapt artificial intelligence, but also to helping some of the pure play artificial intelligence companies that exist, because there are some pretty amazing ones here in Queensland, and actually promoting that to the rest of the world, so that hopefully we can actually have some companies that have that global scale and reach without having to leave our shores.
So I think, that sort of segues into a conversation or a question around technology risk. And I mentioned, I spoke to Lani Rafidi yesterday, and we had the discussion around technology risk. One of the things that is amazing to me, and to your point of the Robotics Roadmap and uncovering these invisible companies that are doing amazing things, is over the last couple of months, I've been engaged to help pull together the Fire Tech Connect program, which is really trying to accelerate fire technologies. And when I was first approached, I sort of went, well, how many fire companies could there be out there, that are doing technology? Well, I just can't believe the amount of talent and the amount of companies that are out there, not only in Queensland, but all over Australia. And they're either working specifically in the fire technology sector, or they've got perfect transposable use cases into the emergency services fire case. And, it ranges, there's all sorts of things from, satellite technology, sensors, virtual mapping, 3D rendering from drones. It's just unbelievable what's out there. So is it just that we're really bad at sort of putting these forward? And as I'm interviewing a lot of these companies, and I go and say to my wife, wow, this company's doing ABC. And her question, being a non-technical person, is, why aren't we using these technologies? So that has become my catch cry now, is why aren't we using these technologies? So it's to uncover that. And one of the things that I've discovered is this bureaucratic inertia that exists. It's the just doing the same thing over and over, and one of the 25-year veteran firefighters said to me yesterday that unfortunately nothing happens until somebody actually dies, and then there's some change that is made. And so to that technology risk, when we talk about life and death technologies, and health is a great example, if somebody comes up with a new vaccine or a new pharmaceutical, they go through a rigor through the FDA in the US or the TGA in Australia. And the idea of that is to test, clinical trial, mitigate risk, verify, run it through a rigor, and then present it to the procurement, the governments or the corporates, and say, hey, it's been through FDA approval, right?
Yep.
Why don't we have something like that from a robotics perspective, or from a technology, more broader technology perspective, that puts them through that type of rigor, that de-risks it for the governments and the procurement side?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, the only answer I can think of is that, there is more money in pharmaceuticals because of the high volume, right? So I think that's an issue. And also, hardware is quite complex. Obviously, the human body and how it interacts with drugs is also complex, but I think they've got a pretty well-trodden path. I think it's something that we should definitely trial. But I think the other issue that you pointed out is, the invisibility of many of these companies who are doing great things. And that's where I think what you're doing with fire tech is so important, because I actually think it's important. Because I think at the heart of all of these issues is the fact that we are a nation of small to medium-sized enterprises. I think in Queensland alone, more than 90% of people are employed by a company that has 20 or less people. So how can we expect companies of that size to be able to communicate, with the rest of Australia that they exist, but also to undergo a process like FDA approval, which, really it's the big farmers that take on a lot of that, and they usually have significant investment backing them whenever they're trialing a new drug or vaccine. So there's a difference in scale that is important to recognize, and I'm not sure I know exactly what the answer is, but I think things like fire tech and things like the Queensland AI Hub, things like the Queensland Robotics Cluster are going to be crucial in trying to break that down, because it gives the opportunity for those small players to work in together to actually improve the profile of all of them. And perhaps if there was a way that we could actually help to bundle all of those companies up, support them through a process that, as you've described, of getting their technologies tested, then that would be a very worthwhile thing to do. But I think there's definitely a difference in the scale of funding available to support those activities.
Well, it's like I use the hashtag a lot of the time. Not another coffee app. Problems worth solving. Hashtag problems worth solving, and it amazes me all the time. You see, it's another fitness app or another recipe app, or and they get $3 million, and yet there's a retrofitting robotic device that can help disabled people get in and out of the car, and they need 300,000 for the prototype, and they can't raise the money.
Yeah.
And then we see these sort of, startup T-shirt people on the front page of the Financial Review because they raised $5 million for, to save people 10 minutes in a coffee queue. I find that very frustrating.
Well, and we have superannuation funds who, potentially could be investing in helping these technologies go forward. Yeah, there's a number of structural barriers that we need to break down. I think, perhaps it's just a matter of mapping those out and taking them on
one by one.
One by one. I'm happy to work with you on that, Lee.
Look, I'd love to recruit you on the mission, because, I think we are a lucky country, and I think that I have been critical of the government in the past, particularly over the fire season and the handling of all of that. But I think they've done a remarkable job, both the federal cabinet and the state governments, to contain this virus that could have been, had a major impact. And so in that regard, when you look what's happening in the US and around in other parts of the world, we are really lucky. we are an island. We're a big island. We need to look after our domestic supply chain, and we need to look after our local technology companies. And it is frustrating that, you know, we keep losing these great minds and great companies overseas. So,
well, maybe this is our opportunity to bring them back, because who wouldn't want to live in Australia at the moment?
that's right.
Yeah.
I certainly said to my wife the other day, I think we've done our time in the States. I loved it. I loved every minute of it, but it's not a place that I would be wanting to go and live and take my family at the moment, which is sad. It's sad for me to say that, but that's the reality of it. So
Yeah.
just in one final question, in terms of Queensland, obviously you have you're based in Brisbane and based in Queensland, and we do have this state sort of rivalry among states, and there tends to be sort of a bit of silos, and we hear a lot of talk about ecosystems. I find a lot of it over the last 5 years has just been a lot of party popping and bluster. But then we also have this sort of state rivalry, which might be great for football, but it's not great for building ecosystems and collaboration. Do you see that as a challenge? And what would your suggestion be is how do we break down those silos?
Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge. And I think, you know, unfortunately, you know, I'd love to know how you break those down. The approach that I take is really just about trying to connect the communities. So, you know, if you can help to establish, you know, for example, every time I go down to Melbourne, I try and connect in with their robotics meetup group, which, you know, I also help to start, because, you know, they've got a great range of, you know, research and companies that are down there, but no one was really picking those pieces up together. But yeah, if they then just remain focused only internally, then I think we're just missing out an opportunity. But I guess there has to be a reason for people to want to look at things from the national level. And, you know, I think the roadmap is probably a good example of a reason why people would buy into a more national vision, because it then gives much more backing for investment decisions. So yeah, it's all very well to say that, yeah, in Melbourne, we're really good at developing XYZ robots. But, you know, why should people care if you can then demonstrate that actually Australia has this really strong capability for these reasons, and we just happen to be implementing it in Melbourne? And so, you know, this is why it's a good reason to, you know, I think that makes all the difference. But I guess, yeah, to break down the barriers, it's about, you know, what is the value proposition for people acting in a more national cohesive way? And I think sometimes we don't actually have that argument. We don't have that value proposition.
Maybe a national innovation agenda at a federal level might help. I find it interesting that we do really well at the Olympics. You know, when we send a team to the Olympics, it's the Australian team. There's not a lot of emphasis put on which state they've come from. We work together as an Australian team, and we punch above our weight in terms of sport. And when we, you know, people get to wear the Australian colours, they do it with pride. But then when we come to sort of innovation and technology and entrepreneurship, it's this sort of fierce, slug-it-out battle between the states.
Yeah, but then look at how successful the Australian Institute of Sports was for many years at helping to influence that, right? So that's where, you know, you really do have a good value proposition for taking a national approach to things. You know, on the other hand, very important, as I mentioned, with clusters, to have local initiatives. You need them at all levels, but if they remain disconnected and competitive, it's just counterproductive. And so, you know, I think that we really also have to keep a close eye on what's going on in the rest of the world, because in other parts of the world, some countries have been very good at implementing both robotics and AI strategies. And I think that, you know, that should give us some hope for the future if we can do the same.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think that's a good note to finish on. Thank you, Sue, for your time today. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks,
and,
Lee.
you know, and from FireTech Connect's perspective, we love to talk to CSIRO and Data61 as to how we can partner to help, you know, accelerate and make some of these fire tech companies that are invisible, give them some profile and give them some acceleration.
Yes, great. That'd be awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Lee.
Bye.
Bye.